You're listening to the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Please remember to subscribe to the show wherever you are listening. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 210 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, Ben Eagle. We're in the southwest this week, and I'm meeting sheep farmer and chief executive at the Farm Carbon Toolkit, Liz Bowles. Liz has rich experience as an advisor to farmers, farmer-controlled businesses, retailers, food service providers, and processors on all things sustainable farming, whether that's practice or whether that's developing and managing sustainable supply chains. For 20 years, she was at ADAS, now the UK's largest independent provider of agricultural and environmental consultancy services. They also do policy advice, research and development. She was also at the Soil Association as Associate Director of Farming and Land Use for nearly 9 years. And she's been an independent consultant since 2012. Liz farms Pedigree Shropshire sheep on the slopes of the Exe Valley near Tiverton in Devon, which has been a passion of hers for many years, but she spends most of her time these days in her role at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So, I mean, a huge amount to talk about today. It's one of those episodes where you really don't know where to start. So I'm actually going to probably leave that up to Liz. But first of all, Liz, welcome to Meet the Farmers. Thank you for coming on.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much, Ben. Yeah, it's really nice to be on the programme.
Oh, it's great to have you. So I say I'm going to leave it up to you. I'm actually going to steer it towards Farm Carbon Toolkit, I think, first of all. I'm sure that lots of listeners will have heard about what you do, but just give us a brief introduction.
Absolutely. So the Farm Carbon Toolkit is an organisation that was set up by farmers for farmers in 2011. And it was very much set up to support farmers to better understand their farm carbon footprint. At the time, it was something really that not many people paid much attention to or certainly had any idea about. And so back then, the organisation actually set about creating the first carbon calculator for agriculture. I think it was probably one of the first ever developed in the UK. And ever since then, really, we've been developing the calculator and making it as helpful as possible. And the calculator itself has always been one that looks at farm level rather than simply measuring emissions for products that farmers produce. So it means it collects information not just on emissions, but also on carbon sequestration into soils and non-crop biomass. Now, sort of really over a decade since we first started, the idea of farm carbon footprinting is becoming mainstream. And certainly since 2020, the organisation itself has really got larger and larger as people come to us wanting us to help them, whether that be individual farmers, whole estates, or indeed supply chains themselves or businesses that sell into retail. So the whole range. So we now work with the whole range of farm businesses in this country as well as increasingly overseas.
Yeah, and you must have quite a few people on your team now. Certainly whenever you go to an ag event, it almost seems like you see a different person every time.
It might feel like that. I mean, certainly the team's growing fast and we make it, we're very keen to see farmers and really be where farmers are, because it's something that to help farmers, it's very important to sort of understand the challenges and to be really sat beside them. So it's nice that you keep on seeing my team out and about. That's really lovely to hear. And certainly my involvement with the organisation started way before I became chief exec last year. I'd known Adam Twine since the mid-80s. When I came back from being a VSO, he and I and another number of other concerned farmers set up the Farmers World Network, really concerned about what was going on in agriculture across the globe. And then I met Adam again when I joined the Soil Association, and a few years later I was invited to be a director at the Farm Carbon Toolkit. So I'd been a director since about 2016 and really seen how the organisation was growing very rapidly, and could see also the potential, because as one of the three main calculators in use in the UK, we're the only one that's owned by farmers. It is truly independent, and I would say is very much batting for farmers. And it feels like it's a very necessary tool for farmers to have.
Do you think that UK ag is moving fast enough? This is a bit of an unfair question, perhaps, but do you think it's moving fast enough when it comes to tackling climate and carbon issues on a farm level? And let's stick on that farm level.
Yeah, I mean, it's not an unfair question at all, because I think there's various different levels for this. I say, and literally, I've just this morning been reading all the applications for our Carbon Farmer of the Year competition, and have been absolutely blown away with the quality of the entries in terms of the farmers' knowledge of the issues and what they're doing about it. So I would say that to me was not really a surprise, but it was lovely to see it. So I would say there are individual farm businesses across the country who are doing phenomenal things. And that's why we've launched this Carbon Farmer of the Year competition, to celebrate those, but also to share as widely as possible the learnings from the farmers who are in this space. I would say probably, though they're in a bit of a minority at the moment, my guess is that the majority of farmers are somewhat confused by what they should be doing, and also the kind of mixed messages that are coming from different government departments on this. I mean, for instance, yesterday I was at the Royal Welsh Show, and the topic for the week there has been the announcement from their government, from Welsh Government, that all farms will be required to have 10% tree cover. And then the pushback from the farming unions. And the problem with that is it's divisive, because now everybody is kind of focusing on one little thing rather than on what needs to be done across the whole front for all of us, no matter whether we're a farmer or a citizen. We have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But for farmers, they're in a phenomenal position because they manage land. And that ability to manage land in a positive way, to store carbon in soils or in hedges and trees, is something which no other business actually has access to. So, and I think increasingly farmers are understanding that. They're certainly motivated by the potential to store carbon in soils and in trees for whatever reason. Looking at your question slightly differently, I do think there's a real need for our governments to support farmers better. Sitting where I sit, there is practically no truly targeted support for farmers to help them to understand how their farm produces greenhouse gas emissions and how best they can reduce those within a resilient, thriving, profitable business. And also the realization that for many farm businesses, it's actually, without looking at storing carbon into soils or trees, it will be impossible to get to net zero, simply because of the biological systems they're managing.
So would you say, from your impression at the moment, we're actually almost too reliant on farmers being proactive to make the changes themselves, rather than actually being encouraged to do so?
I think that's a very fair assessment, really. That's what I see. I see farmers who are proactive, who want to do the right thing, perhaps because they've also got a brand they want to promote. They're moving in that direction. There are supply chain actors who are pulling them, and most of that pull at the moment is through requiring them to have a carbon footprint done on their farm. Very often, though, those footprints are done, but there's very little understanding of what the findings mean. And perhaps, there are also some food chain businesses who are really wrestling and trying to work out what the right thing to do is. I think there's a realization that it wouldn't be appropriate to push all the cost for farms getting to net zero down onto farmers. And it's something that the whole supply chain has to share. but finding out or working out the mechanisms to do that is something that those businesses are really wrestling with. Some are offering some kind of payment to farmers if they carry out practices, and that's a welcome start. But it's something I think the whole supply chain really has to wrestle with together and be frank and honest about these things, because what's driving the supply chains themselves is that they've made commitments under the Science Based Targets initiative, and they now need to come good on those targets. But the majority of the emissions they now need to remove, sit on farms outside of their immediate control.
What about other sectors of the economy? I mean, one image that's going around my mind at the moment, which you see all the time now, don't you, of the number of flights in the air at any one time. But at the same time, that being circulated, that might then give farmers, because we're talking about farmers, the impression that actually, well, if that's all that's going on, what can I do? And therefore they feel maybe unfairly targeted. Do you think that's fair?
What I think is happening at the moment is that different groups have got greater capacity for talking about what they're doing in positive ways, and sometimes in ways that really don't tell 100% of the story. And I think for farmers, certainly livestock farmers, I think probably are the ones who feel most victimized, and the number of times in the conversations I'm having with farmers who are ruminant livestock farmers mostly centers on the role of methane and how that is being measured within any given farm carbon footprint, or indeed any greenhouse gas emission conversation. And certainly we know now a lot more about methane than we did, say, 5 years ago, in terms of how it behaves as a gas, about its relatively short life in the environment. And that's something that it will change how we measure emissions in the medium term. But right now, we're stuck with a system that does seem to be pushing farmers more and more towards more intensive livestock production systems. But that completely ignores the impact of livestock on biodiversity, on soil carbon, on all the things that we also want to focus on. And that's the challenge at the moment, this sort of carbon blindness, which doesn't look at the bigger picture. And we will have to look at the bigger picture, but we haven't currently got the right metrics for doing those measurements to take that into account. But I have to say, compared to what it was like about 5-10 years ago, it's less like a holy cheese or a string vest in terms of where the gaps are. Some of those gaps are starting to be filled in, but it's still a pretty stringy vest.
That's a good metaphor and observation. Let's bring this back to your farm. Let's start talking about your farm. Tell us about that and your sheep as well. Okay.
Yeah. I'm very lucky, I think, in the job I have sometimes to be grounded in something really practical, and certainly farming does that for me. It also means that I face exactly the same challenges as all the farmers we're working with. So I'm really lucky, I think, to farm around. It's a tiny farm by comparison. I come from a farming family, so I think I've probably I'm hardwired to want to do something agricultural, almost whether I like it or not. So I farm 100 acres in the Exe Valley and the Calne Valley in Devon. And I always say that my sheep probably have got the best view in Devon if they bothered to put their heads up. So I farm land in the Exe Valley that overlooks both the sea and Exmoor and Dartmoor. And in fact, it's ground it's called a Marilyn because it's more than 150 metres above the surrounding ground all the way round. But that's quite interesting because it means that even though I'm in Devon, that's quite lake ground. So my farm is pretty traditional in that it's permanent grassland and herbal lays. I've put something like 30% of the farm into herbal lays and graze it with my Shropshire sheep. And I have found herbal lays to be really effective, both in improving soil health, but probably most obvious from my point of view has been their ability to feed sheep really well and reduce worm burdens. And that's been phenomenal in terms of more rapid finishing for lambs in the spring. But obviously, my sheep flock is not truly commercial flock. They're very much a pedigree breeding flock. And I've been using Signet recording since 2007. And certainly what that's done is it's enabled me to select the best performing animals. So Signet focuses on growth rate, mothering ability, and actually resistance to worms. So it's a nice multifactorial index for identifying your best performing animals. And it definitely has worked, because lambs now are, if they're going to the abattoir, who generally are the ones that don't pass the mark for breeding, they'll be going 2 to 3 weeks earlier than they were a decade ago with less feed. So The combination of providing better quality feed through herbal lays, probably reducing worm burden, and better genetics is in reducing the cost of sheep production quite phenomenally. Then the challenge, of course, is to make sure those animals look right. And that's the sort of challenge if you're in a pedigree world, that the people buying them, we have two customer base, one who want to buy performance animals and ones that want to buy the ones that will win a show. And if I get all of that into one sheep, I would have cracked it.
That's the ideal. But
it is the ideal.
Whether it's possible or not, it's yet to be seen, I suppose.
No, it's never possible. You're never happy. You're never happy when you're looking. And I'm really lucky in that regard, because as I mentioned before, I guess I really have got agriculture farming sort of hardwired into me. And I was very lucky to have parents who were very knowledgeable, certainly about livestock breeding and livestock selection. In fact, that's the reason I have came into Shropshire sheep, because there's a reason for it. I mean, my parents probably mainly my dad in mid-1970s decided that the sheep breed he had at the time wasn't performing that well, so he decided he fancied a different breed. So he got hold of I think it was a Farmer and Stock Breed, a book on sheep breeds, went through it, decided he liked the look of Shropshires, and proceeded to trot round. Well, mainly it was the West Midlands, buying Shropshires. And at that time, there were only about 200 to 300 registered ewes in the country. So Dad went round, I think he bought about 10 or 15 ewes and 2 or 3 rams, and set about breeding them. And at one point, my parents had the largest flock of Shropshire sheep in the world, which sounds amazing, doesn't it? It was only a flock of 400 ewes, but it did mean that in the period from 1976 through to 2010, the breed came back from being on the RBST endangered list to now being considered as a traditional breed, which means they're not at risk at all. And of course, I wouldn't be doing the breed justice if I didn't mention one of the reasons for that is the fact that they've been found to be relatively tree friendly. So we do now sell sheep we were selling a lot of sheep into Europe prior to Brexit to go into tree plantations, whether that be apples, Christmas trees, vines, all sorts of any kind of plantation, and indeed into sea buckthorn. So anywhere where grazing is required, where it's a right pain to cut grass in tree plantations, putting Shropshire sheep in reduces that burden of activity.
This episode is being supported by our primary sponsor, A-Plan Rural. Why did I want to collaborate with A-Plan Rural? Well, having got to know them, their team shares my passion for giving a voice to farmers, and we are both driven to raise the profile of farming voices to a wider audience, so it seemed quite a good fit. Quite frankly, together we will be able to do a lot more. A-Plan Rural do a lot of work on social media themselves, sharing farming accounts and farming stories. They have a rural community blog which shares farmers' experiences, and they also support a growing number of initiatives that champion UK farmers, including this podcast. So a big thank you to A-Plan Rural for supporting Meet the Farmers. Are the genetics of your flock now, can you trace those back to your parents' flock, or is it a separate?
Directly. Yeah. I mean, my parents only stopped keeping sheep I think it was foot and mouth that they decided they'd had enough, because prior to that, they would have gone round to, they still had 300 breeding ewes in 2001. Yes, so my flock is established from theirs. So yes, the direct link, which is quite nice.
Let's go all the way back. And I mean, you've already mentioned your parents there, who I'm guessing are going to be a big influence on you. But I'm interested in where your interest in food farming and the land comes from.
Gosh. And that's a funny one, isn't it? Because when you sent the questions across and I looked at it, I'm not sure I ever really stopped to think about it. So, and part of me would say, well, perhaps I wasn't that imaginative when I was growing up, because I was pretty happy with what was around me, and perhaps didn't look any further. I would say that it's something that if you grow up surrounded by land, by animals, it's almost a compulsive interest. And that sort of compulsion certainly sort of set root in me, I think, when I was in my early teens and was just really interested, mainly, I would say, in animals. Certainly, if you speak to my husband or anybody, I am not a machinery person, so there was no way I was ever going to go into crop production at an early age, because I can wreck most machines fairly quickly. And although I've got an A-level in physics, I have no clue really how electric works. It's magic as far as I'm concerned. But when it comes to animals, I kind of feel that that's something I really understand how they are, and also that link between the ground that supports them and how they both behave, their health, and how they perform. And that was very much, I think, born in me from a very young age, just seeing it all around me, really. Then I guess I went to Y College, which was then part of London University, to do a degree in animal sciences. And I think I became, at that time, it was almost, well, certainly at Y College, it was almost frowned upon, but I think I was one of the few members of Friends of the Earth at the time.
Really? Okay.
Yes. Well, at Y College, yeah, because it was, it was not the university or ag college where membership of Friends of the Earth was common. And I think probably then what had the most sort of fundamental impact on me was being a volunteer. So after I left university, I was lucky enough to be one of the last people that was accepted onto VSO straight out of university. So as a very naive, very idealistic 21-year-old, I found myself living in the wilds of Zambia. And it was wild too. I had a bicycle with a square tire, as I remember it, or a square wheel, and was really thrown into that completely different environment. Also, that environment where choice was minimal. And I think it bore in me that real feeling of just how wasteful the Western world was by comparison. You know, if you wanted soap or shampoo, there might be one thing you could buy, and that you wouldn't have any choice. So it was that or nothing. And actually, it kind of made me really think about just that waste of resources and how we've been, and actually the whole of my grown-up lifetime has seen that focus on specialization and really on not thinking about consequences of actions. And one particular course at university really bore that home to me. Doing animal sciences, I don't know why, but we had to do the philosophy of science as well. And I got introduced to Karl Popper and this idea of holism versus reductionism. And effectively, my view is, and it's my view, is that science has focused very much on reductionist principles in agriculture for probably since the war, really. We've been focusing on wanting to maximize yields of everything and focusing on one thing and not worrying about everything else that's going on around and about it. And that's why we've probably ended up where we are, because we haven't properly thought about the impacts, the unintended impacts of what we were trying to achieve. Whereas if you looked at these things holistically, and you'd look in the round. So we never would have kind of accepted some of the consequences of our actions. So, for instance, I mean, the classic one is, I mean, I'd always known, especially during my stint in ADAS, that applying artificial nitrogen fertilizers will acidify ground. That was a consequence. You live with it. And there was no question that you'd do anything different to avoid soil being acidified. You just dealt with it then later. And I think that's kind of how we have become accepting of all of those kind of things in science. But I think now the new era of, call it regenerative, call it agroecological agriculture, is wanting to work in harmony with nature rather than having to keep fixing things as we break them. And I kind of learnt that from university a little bit, but from Zambia as well, because they couldn't use the resources. They didn't have anything. So it was then having to rely on nature. And it's kind of quite deep rooted really in that sort of area. And that's also what led me into being an advocate to some degree, an advocate of organic farming, because ultimately we're all going to have to farm more or less organically, I feel.
I'm really interested in this sort of approach, this holistic approach to your mindset, I'm going to say, actually, that seemed to root itself quite early on. And this certainly seems to have sort of brought about that trajectory through your career. Did you actively sort of approach your career, which has been varied, with that sort of in mind, or have you just gone from one thing to the next, just not really knowing what's coming up next?
No, I don't think I'm that clever to actually start off with an objective in mind. I don't think anybody ever can really, because it's always down to luck, I think, as much. I mean, you might have a career trajectory in mind and you might be wanting to plot the points, but life has a habit of telling you that's not going to happen. And in fact, I shall never forget when my children were at school, some of us parents got wheeled into doing sixth form interviews for kids to help them with their university entrance. And this one chap came one day, and I kind of marveled at him because he was so clear about where he was going to be by the time he was 30. I'd love to go back now and actually check in with him whether he got there. But, no is the answer. I mean, I think the only thing that tends to happen is probably as you go through your career in life, the kind of principles you have kind of, in my case, subconsciously in my brain, means that some things you just don't go for because they don't feel right. And so that in a way you kind of navigate through the maze, at least I did, just by ignoring some things if they would feel like, oh gosh, I really wouldn't want to be doing that. It's like, for instance, when I came back from being a VSO, having got a degree in animal sciences, I thought I better, definitely had to get a job. And the first interview I went for was with the feed business, and they were looking for scientists, which I was. So I got a decent degree in animal sciences. So I trotted along to their offices and we had a lovely conversation. And they were basically looking for people who would be spending most of their time circling around in a fistulated cow. Now, a fistulated cow is a cow that's got a hole in her straight into a rumen so they can test out the impact of different foodstuffs. So I was sort of sitting in this interview thinking about it and thinking, there's just no way I want to do that. So we got to the end of the interview. I didn't actually give them the opportunity to say they didn't want to offer me the job. I don't know if they did. I don't know if they would have done. I just simply said, look, it's been really lovely speaking to you, but
you knew.
I would have. Oh, it would be awful. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I could have done the job. Well, possibly, but yeah. And I think probably listening to when your brain tells you that is probably quite a good thing for your mental health.
Absolutely. Listen to your gut when it tells you that. I mean, cutting quite a lot of the story out, you did eventually end up at the Soil Association, and you were there for
nearly a decade. Nearly a decade
there. And I'm just really interested in your sort of view in terms of your experience there, because it was a big time between the beginning of that and the end of that time. There was a lot that went on really in terms, I suppose, the trajectory of thought generally. probably not to the extent that we are now, certainly with the regen debate, but there was a lot of change. And I'm just really interested in your perspective on that in terms of how the organisation itself changed, but also how the trajectory of how we thought about food and farming at that time changed, in your view.
Yeah, I mean, and you're right, it was. So I joined Soil Association in 2013 and left in 2022 last year. And I would say that my kind of abiding mantra on joining the organisation was that I wanted what the Soil Association did to be relevant to all farmers. And I know that if you go back far enough, the Soil Association had been seen by many farmers to be an organisation that was critical of them. And that didn't feel reasonable to me, and especially because all my family are farmers. And I've always, really throughout my career, almost had certainly my dad sitting on my shoulder and me thinking, well, what would a reasonable farmer think about this? Because I think that's a very good sort of watchword to have. You might think it would stop you being too controversial, and I guess to some degree it possibly does. But it also means, because certainly at the Soil Association, if you think about one of their main tenets, it was to encourage more farmers to be organic. And there's no way that farmers are going to be encouraged to join a movement if they feel they're being criticised. Yeah. So it was that kind of wanting to really be an organisation that, even if the farmers were never going to become organic, that's not a problem, because part certainly of the mission of my team was to support more agroecological farming. And in a way, organic farming is a destination for some, but not for all in that space. And certainly through the programs that my team developed through the period I was at the organisation, I'm really proud of the Innovative Farmers Programme, because it's enabled great networking amongst farmers. It has brought topics to farmers' notice that otherwise they would never have seen. I mean, I only got involved in actually looking after two farmers' field labs. One was on compost teas and the second one was on destroying cover crops without glyphosate. And both were fascinating. I mean, until I actually was asked to run this field lab on compost teas, I honestly did not know what a compost tea was. I mean, I literally did not. I didn't know. And if you go back to 2013, the knowledge on compost teas was nothing like it is now. Yeah. And I would put some of that increase in knowledge down to that field lab. And similarly with cover crop destruction, we had farmers wanting to basically design all these bits of kit that would crush a cover crop into submission. And, we certainly learned a lot about the benefits of frost, the destroying cover crops, and all of that really. But the best bit of it all was the networking amongst the farmers and the ability then to share ideas. And I think that's for me is the greatest value of most of the work that I've been involved with in the last decade, has been about enabling much better farmer networking. And it's been massively enabled by social media. The fact that you can now do a podcast so relatively easily compared to what it would have been to have done this a decade ago. And, it's so easy for anybody to post something and for other people to look at it, like it or whatever. And certainly within the field labs, the WhatsApp groups were fantastic, because what I have learned is farmers love sharing photos of a crop.
Yeah.
And actually it's great because you can immediately see what's going on. You don't necessarily have to travel there to see what's going on because it's on your phone. And that's brilliant. But the one thing I would sort of say during my stint at the Soil Association, just really to demonstrate how everybody's mindsets have completely changed in the last decade, is this. 2015 was the International Year of Soils. And in 2014...
Gosh, was it that long ago?
It was.
Wow.
It was, because that was the year, I only know it because it was the year that we started the Farm Carbon Toolkit Soil Farmer of the Year, because we did it to coincide with International Year of Soils. So Soil Association we had some sort of policy meeting that I was involved in, and I brought this up, that this was the thing. And at that time, soil had such a low profile. The number of soil scientists in the UK was dwindling rapidly because the topic was not of interest to many people. If you were a soil scientist, you were kind of not at all interesting. And to the extent that at that point, the Soil Association didn't initially feel that this was an international year that they wished to promote, because they didn't think it would have much impact.
Wow.
We did.
That says a lot.
We did, and it did. And yes, but it was, I think probably that was it must have been almost the low water mark of that interest. But it just, that International Year of Soils, and it really does demonstrate how, if enough people get behind something, it can really make things change. And I think sometimes that's something that you don't recognize at the time, because at the time you're all just working away, beavering away, trying to make things change. It's only when you look back on something with the benefit of hindsight that you can see that things have changed, because at the time you don't see it, and the change itself is incremental. But then suddenly when you look back, you realize that, goodness me, it's a massive shift. So that was one. And the second one, I would say, is when the Soil Association brought out its report into nitrogen. Can't remember what the report was called. And there was real concern about talking about the need to reduce reliance on artificial nitrogen fertilizers as part of the transition towards net zero for agriculture, because there was a time when and it still is, I guess, still quite largely the case, that it is impossible to feed people without using artificial nitrogen fertilizers. But that viewpoint is changing. And certainly if UK agriculture is to fully play its part, or indeed any agriculture fully play its part in this journey to net zero, we will have to find ways of massively reducing our reliance on fossil fuel-based fertilizers, certainly. And that's something that would have almost been a heresy to have said that a number of years ago, but that now that realization is fairly clear.
Meet the Farmers is brought to you by RuralPod Media, the only podcast production agency to specialise in the rural sector. We're on a mission to make rural stories mainstream and help businesses, organisations and communities like you tell your story through podcasting. Podcasting is a fantastic way of connecting with your audience, whoever that might be, getting your message out there and networking with leaders in your niche. RuralPod Media can help you by launching your new podcast or helping you with the technical side. We also provide podcast training and an audit service if you already have a podcast, you're not sure where to take it to next. For more information or to book a call, visit ruralpodmedia.co.uk. That's ruralpodmedia.co.uk. That draws us quite nicely onto my next big question, which is the challenges question that we often have on the show, which is, what for you is the biggest challenge that we face in agriculture today? And can you provide a potential solution?
Oh,
there you are, Liz.
Oh, there we go. So what is the big... I'm always good because I will try... I'm not a politician, so I won't give you an answer that suits me. I'll try and answer your question, which is probably very foolish. I think the biggest challenge, there's so many of them, but if I just think about the ones that are sort of on top. So there is, the removing ourselves from reliance on fossil fuels is probably the biggest challenge, actually, because we will have to. And I think it's been one of the biggest, kind of misleading of a population that has happened for the last 30, 40, 50 years, that we can't survive without fossil fuels. And it's probably been perpetrated on us by those selling fossil fuels. But we will have to, and it will challenge fundamentally how we produce food. And this whole sort of debate about land sparing, land sharing, for me, I'm fully in the land sharing group. mainly because the way I've changed how I think about how I farm, and I'm not good at it yet, so I'm not saying I've got there, is to think about all the animals that would like to call my farm home, and thinking and plants, and thinking about, actually, does my farm provide somewhere to live and something to eat for the animals that are going to be awake to want to eat in the months of the year that they're on the farm? And that fundamentally then affects how you farm, because you need to think about, you can't just completely erase every scrap of vegetation at any one time, because that will definitely evict them. So there's that kind of challenge about, actually, how do we farm in a way that enables us to properly respond to not just the climate emergency, but the decline in nature. Because there's one big fundamental thing that I think, as farmers, we possibly have seen nature as a nice to have in the past. I mean, in a way, it was because it was cosseted into agri-environment schemes. It was a nice to have, or it was something to do if you had poorer quality land, as a mechanism for earning something from that land. Increasingly now, we better understand that the ecosystem services are fundamental to our ability to produce food. And primarily that means we have to have healthy soil, and we have to have clean water and clean air. And I think it's making that distinction in all our minds between it being a nice to have and an absolute essential. And that's probably the biggest challenge, actually, to get all farmers to better understand that, because that completely changes then how you think about everything you do. Yeah. And it may sound a little bit preachy, but we're kind of seeing it in that the extreme weathers we're getting, farms which do have better soil health are faring much better. I mean, I appreciate that if you're going to get 4 inches in an hour, clearly you can't deal with that. But, it helps. So that, I would say, those are the biggest challenges. And in terms of providing solutions, because I always like to think about how do we do that. For me, it starts with schools and then ag colleges, because I don't know properly of any college that is properly addressing this yet within their curriculum. And I don't buy it that all us farmers just know how to do it. It's in our DNA, because I think we've lost it, if ever we had it. And it's certainly not been something anybody's been taught at university or at college, and it just needs to be normalized, so it's not seen as being something a bit odd. And you don't put it in the box with organic and other things. It should be mainstream, and that farming with ecosystem function in mind should be front and center. And but it's actually a fantastic opportunity as well, and that will fund. And I think that goes hand in hand with the thing we've been kind of told for decades, that only intensive farming will feed the world. And I definitely don't buy that one, because we waste an awful lot of food and we eat far too much. And actually an awful lot of food, I think we've got enough calories to feed everybody about 3,000 odd calories. And I'm not saying that we all have to become vegan at all. What I'm saying is that there's an ability to farm more holistically, still produce enough food. Food might be more expensive, but I don't think it's agriculture farmers' job to be the social service in terms of producing food to a price.
Yep.
And I know that sounds a bit controversial, because I appreciate that where we are right now, that simply doesn't work, because people simply can't afford to buy expensive food. But that's more to do with our social system than it is to do with forcing farmers to produce food that has been produced in such a way that it's causing adverse consequences, both for soil, water, air, and indeed the animals.
Yeah, and the usual way of food poverty isn't just food poverty; it is poverty.
No, it's poverty. Yeah, it's not food poverty at all. It's just if you haven't got enough money, you haven't got enough money.
So there's couple of calls there, both for policymaker listeners out there on the education front, but also I enjoyed how you actually sort of touched on that mindset shift for farmers on a farm level as well, of looking at your farm as a habitat in itself, and actually looking for how can you provide a space for various species to live as well, and actually managing your farm as an ecosystem in itself.
I mean, it's lovely. I had one guy I was talking to, he actually sells cover crop seeds. And I think he got to the point of actually saying to one farmer he wouldn't sell him the seeds because he just wanted to put a pollinator strip down a field. And it was only going to be there for a month or so when it flowered. And he hadn't got anything else on the farm or within miles where those pollinators would go once the pollinator strip had finished. And, there's that kind, and in a way that does mean the support that farmers get does need to change to better reflect that need, because it's quite, you as a farmer, you're perfectly entitled to be paid to put in pollinator strips. Whether or not they actually support pollinators is quite another matter.
Just a little more about our primary sponsor, A-Plan Rural. They provide bespoke insurance cover for farms and estates. This could be for anything from tractors and machinery to a new exciting diversification venture. So for more information, visit aplan.co.uk/rural. That's aplan.co.uk/rural. We're going to start to round this up.
Yes,
time is flying. So I'm going to ask you the final few questions I ask everyone at the end of the show. The first is, Liz, what would your message to the public be? Any message?
I guess my message to the public is, firstly, that there are so many farmers out there who are doing phenomenally brilliant things to produce really great food, but in environments that are supporting ecosystem service function and wildlife and reversing the decline in nature. And for people, it's really hard. I appreciate how difficult it is for them to be able to, because the main way that people, the public, can interact with agriculture is through the food that they buy. That really, I think, is the major way that people can interact with farmers. And that there has, I think there is an increasing disconnect. And again, I remember this from when my days in ADAS. At that time, farmers were under far less financial pressure than they are now. So very often other family members wouldn't need to work off farm. And that meant that the farm was far better connected within the rural society. And that's been lost. So I think it's almost like, and I see it sometimes, that public people who want to know more about what's going on their farms are instigating those relationships themselves. And I think that's a really great way forward to almost, there's no reason why the public should, group of people through things like, I don't know, Nextdoor or whatever it is, can almost instigate those building relationships with those farmers. I mean, clearly the farmer's going to want to be involved, but I think I just see that as just a great way to recreate those connections, so that both farmers and the people who live around them would benefit from just that conversation. And in fact, we've done something like that with one of the projects that the Farm Carbon Toolkit's working on at the moment. It's called Farm Net Zero in Cornwall, and it sees the whole community in that area as being the group to work with. So the farmers are learning things, for instance, on composting or herbal lays or whatever it might be. And then there's a session with anybody who wants to come along to talk about how that's relevant to the general public. So if you're a gardener, for instance, all the things that they're learning is of direct relevance to anybody wanting to grow anything. And I think that just builds those bridges straight away.
And your message to farmers?
I don't know if I presume to have a message to farmers. That feels A, like a hostage to fortune, and B, I think well above my station. I mean, as a body of individuals, I think that I'm always in awe of their ability to do so many things. And I think if ever you want anything done, if you get a farmer, the chances are they'll better get it done. Is that just ability to hold so many things in their heads at one time, which is it's part. I know it's part of the job description, isn't it? But increasingly, there's less and less people that can do that. So actually, it's a super skill that farmers have, although they don't realise it. So I'm going to duck that one because I kind of feel like I don't want to be saying to farmers what they should be doing.
That's fine. I'm going to read between the lines there and say that your message to farmers is that they're all superheroes, which I'm sure they'll love. So
you can if you like. I'm not. I couldn't possibly say. Oh dear. No, there's a thought.
We'll do that. And finally, a recommendation for a blog, podcast, or social media account to follow, which can be farming or non-farming.
Oh my goodness. I think the one that I tend to follow most that I really do enjoy is the one that Rory Stewart does with Campbell.
Rest is politics.
Yeah, I'm afraid I since Brexit, I've become far more politicised than I've ever been in my life. And I'm pretty sure it's because they're making such a rubbish hand of it.
Well, the election is just around the corner. It's going to be an interesting year next year.
It's going to be great, isn't it?
Liz, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure having you.
It's been lovely to be on.
That is it for today. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to the show wherever you're listening. Leave us a review. Next time, we'll be back in Wales, and I'm speaking to former dairy farmer and the editor of Practical Farm Ideas magazine, Mike Donovan. Great story there. Thanks again to Liz for today and to our primary podcast sponsor, A-Plan Rural Insurance, for supporting the show. Please see the show notes for more information and for any links mentioned today. For now, though, I'm Ben Eagle. This has been Meet the Farmers. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you all have a great week.